The fifth consideration in designing a network is to determine who integrates the network. Now, potential players are the governments. They can integrate themselves, and that's usually what happens is you have a number of partners and companies, and the government sits in the middle and coordinates the action of them all. You can have a prime contractor. That's an example where a case where the government would contract, say, with a big IT company to manage the IT infrastructure of a ministry or a city or any public agency. And then that contractor would then subcontract with other contractors as they need. But then you can have a third party that is not involved in the production of services but can still coordinate. You have some countries when they negotiate public transport infrastructure contracts, say a number of trains, metros, and so on. Since they do that every 5 years or every 10 years, they don't have internal expertise, so they might just get some advisors in to manage the negotiation or manage the project, but that partner will only be their advisor. They won't be involved in the actual production of the transport equipment. So those are the three potential players, and the questions you need to ask to choose who's going to do it is, first you look at whether the government has the capacity to do it. Does it have the expertise? Does the private sector have more expertise than the government, in which case you might want to send that to the private sector. You look at which model or which integrator would promote the most accountability in the network, and whether you have important capital investment costs and whether startup speed is important. If you're trying to provide a new service that the government did not produce before and that was offered by the private sector, and there's always a way to do it with the government, but if it takes you 2 years to set up and build the expertise and the private sector already has it, you might want to start with the private sector. Another thing that you have is that you need to consider is what are the consequences if a third-party integrator fails. So if you're building building trains and you don't get your trains on time, what happens? If it's really important and there's no contingency, sometimes this would call for the government to act as an integrator and make sure that everything is okay. Because even if you build financial penalties, that's all fine. The company might have specialties, but if you absolutely need those trains for, say, the Olympic Games, then the consequences to the government are actually worse than the consequences to the private company. The last point you need to look at is whether there are any regulatory constraints that would prevent the government or and sometimes private companies from acting as integrators. The fifth criteria, the fifth consideration you need to look at is what should be integrated. What do you send to the network? What do you keep inside the government? In looking at that, you need to rigorously analyze what can best be delivered by any of the partners. That is the same process as private companies go through when they decide to outsource. They look at whether they should keep things in-house or they should outsource. What is critical to the government's mission? And is there any interdependency between what you're outsourcing and what you're keeping in-house? So if you decide that a particular process is really important, it's core to your mission, but it's so tightly integrated with another process that you're going to outsource, what you've basically done is you've outsourced your core competency because it is so tightly linked. The sixth and last consideration that one needs to look at when designing a network is the government core. And by government core we mean what are the core values that governments must protect? And how can the integrity of these values be protected in the network? So an example where the core values of the government would not be protected is if you have tobacco companies run schools or hospitals and they put publicity. And although they might give you all the money you want, they can be very efficient at it and very good, but it sort of contradicts one of the missions of the government in preserving healthcare and promoting healthcare. So this should not be this step should not be forgotten. In our critique of the network literature that we just reviewed, we tried to integrate some of the concepts that we had seen prior in our prior lectures, especially the concepts of the 4 pillars. Now we saw that the governing by network could enhance good governance, as measured by 3 of the 4 pillars. So accountability will be enhanced by having clear contracts with networks, with network partners. And sometimes these contracts can be clearer than if you have all the work done in a government agency where it's a bit fuzzy who's responsible for what. The transparency can be enhanced by having these agreements subject to public scrutiny, in which in most democracies they would be. The participation pillar would also be enhanced if you have a lot of network partners that are from different groups and societies, which would then engage with the state. Governing by networks can also increase administrative effectiveness as measured by the 3 E's, well, the 4 E's, but only 3 apply here. Economy and efficiency would apply because you get access to cheaper suppliers or just better suppliers sometimes. And effectiveness can be increased if the government designs its networks properly and focuses on its key mission-critical elements. So if the government really focuses where it's good and when it adds value and let the other partners take care of what they're best at, you will get just better public outcome. There are some pitfalls, however, to governing by networks that was not covered too much in the literature. For example, the capacity of public organizations can be reduced, which eventually might lead to worse outcome. An example is a public administration. The example I have is the city of Montreal that over time started outsourcing that somewhat outsourced even went to outsource the competency it had to negotiate public service contracts. And you end up with large contracts, and the last one is the contract that was signed for water meters that cost substantially more than every other contract in every other major city in the region. And academics and journalists and now even police officers are looking at these contracts to understand what happened. And what seems to have happened is that the city was relying completely on the private sector, did not keep enough expertise inside to negotiate the contract. So the outcomes of that network was actually to lower the state's capacity. The partners, we talked about the fact that we could have cheaper partners and better suppliers and so on. They don't necessarily operate in competitive markets. The example would be public transportation in Singapore. You have 2 companies running buses. Now, we're not suggesting that there's something wrong with the current pricing of their service, yet we have to point out that a sector with 2 companies is not a competitive market. You have other cases where the expertise is so specialized that you always have like 1 or 2 companies in a country or region, which makes you think that the government is probably not getting the best price it could. The last is the partner's ability or willingness to assume risk is sometimes very theoretical. The example I had was the Olympic Games. If you need to deploy all this infrastructure, you can have as many partners as you can and can have as many penalty clauses as you can, but the government still has more risk in the end than private partners. In our view, the most important element of network design, however, is to approach it with an open mind. There are some good advantages and some disadvantages and pitfalls. If you rigorously analyze each case separately and not approach it with an ideology behind it, you will be able to design effective network. And an example of an ideology you should not want to have is the fact, for example, if you think that companies can always deliver better service than government in all cases, you'll end up designing networks, or you'll end up outsourcing some of the core missions of the state, and you'll get worse public outcomes. We say that in all cases, sufficient measures should be taken to ensure that the state's actions are not captured by one of the partners. And these measures should include identifying and maintaining the public sector's expertise in the network activity so that the state can still be effective at regulating the network and intervening in the network if it needs to. This concludes our presentation for today on collaborative governance. Now that we've done some of the work, it's your turn to do some of it too. We will open up 5 discussion topics on IVLE, and we will ask you to participate in them and debate them using the concepts that we have seen today or concepts that we have seen in other lectures. You can also critique our work if you disagree with our interpretation of the readings. These topics will be posted today on IVLE, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.